A political theorist, a moral theologian, an economist, and a philosopher walk into a bar. Okay, maybe it's a little bit early for the bar. Josh, I thought we were supposed to have drinks, for these. No, but I am hoping that today's session might be a little bit like the conversation that would go on in that bar. This is an author meets critics session on Professor Jason Blakely's book, We Built Reality. And I want to thank each of our panelists for being part of this session and our sponsors, about whom more at the end. And so our author, Dr. Jason Blakely, at the end here, is Associate Professor of Political Science at Pepperdine University. He's written extensively on political theory, political theology, and the social sciences. His most recent book, and the subject of our session, is entitled We Built Reality: How Social Science Infiltrated Culture, Politics, and Power. And it's published by Oxford University Press. The book received accolades from luminaries like Charles Taylor, David Bentley Hart, and Bishop Robert Barron, surely familiar to many of us in this audience. It's been reviewed in outlets including The New Atlantis, Front Porch Republic, and Comment. Professor Blakely also writes regularly on politics and culture in popular venues like Commonweal, The Chronicle of Higher Education, America Magazine, and The Atlantic. He received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and his BA from Vassar College. And he is a senior fellow at the Nova Forum for Catholic Thought at the University of Southern California. So Dr. Blakely, thank you for being with us today and being willing to subject yourself to what I'm sure will be the withering criticisms of these formidable interlocutors. We're about the classical virtues here at Ciceronian Society, and you're demonstrating admirable courage. But of course, we also strive for justice, and so Dr. Blakely will have his opportunity to fire back as well. Let me say just a few more words by way of introduction before we turn to the skewering. Before these distinguished interlocutors offer comments and constructive criticisms. In a 1993 book called The Moral Sense, the late political scientist James Q. Wilson wrote, "We must be careful of what we think we are, because we may become that." Wilson is known for advocating the broken windows theory of crime control, and as an advocate of incarceration as a key tool in criminal justice policy, and he comes in for some criticism in Professor Blakely's book. But in regard to the sentiment that we should be careful of what we think we are, the two would be in wholehearted agreement. The theme of We Built Reality is that social science has never only been about studying human society, but it also has played an active role in shaping social reality. Not always for the better, sometimes in quite malign ways, Blakely argues. As he writes, the core claim is that social science rarely simply neutrally describes the world, but rather plays a role in constructing and shaping it. By means of what he calls the double hermeneutic effect, social science not only describes human reality, but shapes how human beings interpret and experience that reality. And he offers several examples of this process, which occurs through popularization of academic theories and methods in economics, technology, psychology, criminal justice, and international relations. For example, he argues that rational choice theory in economics encourages people to see themselves as egoistic benefit maximizers, as opposed to contributing and participating members of communities. Proliferation of diagnosable and treatable psychological disorders encourages people to diagnose themselves with conditions requiring clinical or pharmaceutical treatment rather than conditions that result from and reflect broader social, political, and perhaps spiritual disorders. And hilarity ensues. He argues for and models an alternative hermeneutic or interpretive approach. He suggests is an essential means of understanding human society. And so the focus, he argues, needs widening to include attention to historical and ideological forces that shape social science itself, the manner in which social scientists influence their ostensible object of study, shaping the way their subjects, who are all of us, interpret and shape human reality. For the purposes of our discussion, our panelists have also reflected on a 2005 lecture by Glenn C. Lowry, a public intellectual and economics professor at Brown University, who is a subscriber to the neoliberal theory of economics. His lecture, entitled Hope in the Unseen, on being a Christian and an economist, considers the role spirituality and faith might play in the social scientific and the general effort to attain a deep understanding of human society. Again, thank you all for being here and joining in this discussion of the important issues that Professor Blakely raises in his book. The panelists will have up to about 10 minutes to offer some initial comments, and then Dr. Blakely will offer brief 4-minute responses to each one, and then we'll have plenty of time to have some general conversation and Q&A from the audience. And so I'll kind of, when you reach 9 minutes of the initial comments, I'll kind of, wave my hand like this a little bit, and then my phone will rudely kind of beep after 10 minutes. Okay, without further ado, let me invite first Dr. Joseph Capizzi to offer his comments. Dr. Capizzi is an ordinary professor of moral theology at the Catholic University of America, where he is also executive director of the Institute for Human Ecology. And he is currently working on a manuscript on property, politics, and development of doctrine. Welcome, Dr. Capizzi. You'll need this.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you to the organizers of the Ciceronian Society. Thank you to Jason for publishing the book and allowing yourself to be subjected to our friendly criticisms. I won't take the 10 minutes, that's for sure. Blakely's book explains and illustrates what he calls the double hermeneutic or double H effects in a variety of social fields, the market and advertising, technology, policing, among others. The point is to show how the unchallenged authority of social science in explaining crisis after crisis were the very theories that helped construct crisis after crisis. That's a quote of his. Unlike other objects of study, human behavior is not merely explained for humans, but the descriptions inform and transform our future behavior. The result is this double H effect by which social science helps build the reality that it purports to understand. Because much of his analysis of technology, free market economics, and other issues he takes up coincides with many of my own dispositions, I'm inclined to agree with Blakely's claims. I do wish, however, the connections were clearer and the definitions more prevalent. I don't recall, for instance, a definition of scientism, a term that appears throughout the text and for which I have only the slightest sense of its meaning. The closest thing to a definition is, I think, on page 13, which is granting undue authority to science. But that definition suggests a problem of hidden agency. Who is it that's granting this undue authority, and who is guilty of being scientistic? The agency problem is one that is worth discussing, and I hope this comes up in the book, and I'll make a final point that connects back to this in a minute. It's something that I'm concerned about throughout the book. There's a lot of notions of agency that are being advanced, and I'm not clear exactly who is being pointed to that is actually being captured by that claim, who it is who's sort of succumbing to the concerns that animates Blakely's analysis. In addition, while I'm drawn to certain kinds of concerns, like, for instance, the individualistic effects of contemporary economic analysis, I do wonder if Daniel Bell's insight about the exaggeration by some social scientists of American individualism doesn't still hold true. Americans form communities, societies, clubs, organizations, teams, partnerships like few other people. Are we really as individualistic as the double H effect might make us think? Throughout, claims are made that theories create reality, that they help construct crisis after crisis. These are powerful claims, but they need fleshing out to be persuasive. At times, I'm not sure Blakely believes them himself. He says much of social science has not this merely descriptive effect. He tells us that he has learned from the tireless work of many social scientists and doesn't wish to criticize all social science or the value of the work of social scientists in general. But this does seem like, the book does seem like an in general criticism of social science. And we are not provided any explanation for the social sciences that might escape the double H effect, or why we should take him at his word for valuing some social science and not others. What are those social scientists doing that the creating reality social scientists are not? Or does Blakely want to make the robust, powerful claim that science of any sort will have both descriptive and performative aspects, given the kinds of human beings we are? Which I think is a claim worth making, but I'd like to hear him make that kind of defense, that in fact this is an in general criticism of science in general, not merely social science, that there's a kind of transitive and intransitive effect of the sciences because of the nature of beings we are. These are all critical comments, obviously, and that's what I understand myself, to be asked to do. And I want to hear Jason's response, because, like I said, I do agree with much of the analysis of, certain sort of conclusions about what social science is saying, but I'm just not yet convinced that social science succumbs in the particular ways that Jason sort of advances. And I want to open up a larger question. That this is what you do. Of course, you eventually turn it back to what you like and what you study. So I want to open up a larger question about something that I care about, which I think actually is to some extent the theme of the book, and it concerns authority. Authority in general, the authority of science, including social science, I think is to some extent the theme of the book. Why and whether we choose to view social science as authoritative is really worth wondering about. Do we actually view it as authoritative? I really just wonder whether non-elites really care about what polls tell them, about what social science think about what they do and how they live their lives. Does it actually impact non-academics, non-elites? So is it authoritative for them? And if it is, why? Why is it becoming an authority? Why do we care about what social scientists think? I think we're all aware of the decline of traditional sources of authority in the modern world as a feature, right, of modern existence, is that traditional sources of authority have either declined, disappeared, diminished. Authority has relocated to other loci, right, other places. And so, like I said, I wonder, is social science really an authority? Does it actually guide action? Does it actually, help people think about the things that they will do? Does it, in other words, actually form reality? Like I said, I remain unconvinced that it does. It could instead be argued that social science exists in the manner it does precisely because it's non-authoritative. This is me now. That is, if we recall Hannah Arendt's distinction between authority, coercion, and persuasion, social science seems to fall into the class of persuasion, which operates in an egalitarian environment. So it's non-authoritative, and it's not coercive, but it's a means of persuasion, which is what an egalitarian system or society requires or allows even, right? And social science might in fact be just like a mode of persuasion. So social science then, in other words, is not an authority, which may very well be borne out by its failures to predict and move behavior, but just another voice seeking to persuade, one whose impact remains unclear despite its obvious success in certain aspects of modern society, especially the media and the academy. Thank you. Oh, you go right after me.
Thank you, Joe. I've been told to, and thanks to the organizers for this. This is really, really beautiful. I've been told to hold myself to 4 minutes in response to each of the panels, so I couldn't possibly hope to answer those questions in any way that's at all persuasive. So, that having been said, I'll make two brief comments on Joe's great questions there about authority and agency. Of course, I think something may be helpful, since a lot of people have not read the book, is Joe's posing the question of what do I mean by scientism, because one of the major preoccupations, you might even say like obsessions, in my work is this problem of scientism. Well, what is scientism? I mean, I think it's Nietzsche who says that any concept with a history can't be defined. And there's a history to the concept of scientism that goes through many iterations. And in that sense, I don't do a very complete job of defining scientism in We Built Reality. That having been said, I associate scientism, I use it in a very specific philosophical way. I mean by scientism the attempt to break down any distinction between the natural and the human sciences. there were different iterations or attempts at this, going back to like Thomas Hobbes comes up in my book. But I think the definition I hang it on in the introduction is this very sharp one given by A.J. Ayer, the analytic logical positivist philosopher who was an advocate of the unity of science, and that's on page 21 to 22 of the preface, where he has this quote. He says, the unity of science will finally mean that, quote, there is no field of experience which cannot in principle be brought under some form of scientific law, and no type of speculative knowledge about the world which it is in principle beyond the power of science to give. Too briefly, but that's one way I think about scientism. Of course, if Ayer were alive today, he would tell me, no, that's just science. But I think of it as an overextension. There are different deployments or usages of this term, and there are different historical iterations of it. But I think one place you might hang the story that I tried to in the opening of We Built Reality is on this attempt to create a total science. I mean, and there are different ways that could happen, right? You could have a unity of method, or a total theory of everything, like a physicalist explanation of everything. Or I think in the opening of The Selfish Gene, Richard Dawkins says the law of stability is the law of all things, you know, like the ultra-Darwinism, he calls it, like even physical objects are explained by natural selection. So that's point one, so the obsession is scientism. Scientism defined historically a concept with a history. That history, I hang the story all too briefly. Joe's right about that on this definition offered by Ayer. Second point, and this I'll stop here because I have to save 4 minutes, is the agency authority problem. I love the question because the title of the book is We Built Reality, like us, like me too. I don't have a very intellectualist view of social science. We do live in a strange situation, I admit, where social scientists feel largely ignored, and yet I'm arguing that they're massively influential. So that's an apparent paradox, but I think that the paradox is resolved because I don't think that the social sciences are primarily intellectual. They are intellectual enterprises. They can start as intellectual enterprises. They can remain separate and kind of unsuccessful as intellectual enterprises, but they're world-making. And so we always inhabit a world already. The ordinary person may not know about Bayesian statistics and like how polling goes down, but every time an election rolls around, and that's an example from the book, gamified polling takes up the practices and world we live in, as opposed to, say, ethnographic inquiry into what your neighbor actually thinks at election time, which I think would be much more fruitful than scorekeeping. So world-making aspect, we dwell through practices and not yet through thought or reflection in inherited practices that are themselves scientific, is what I would say, but all too brief. Enoch, next.
That was just about exactly 4 minutes, so bravo. Let me quickly introduce Dr. Hill. Dr. Enoch Hill is Associate Professor of Economics at Wheaton College. He is interested in the intersection of faith and economics and is currently researching patterns in church attendance and giving surrounding the COVID pandemic. And I know at least some folks here are interested in that. You might want to talk to him about that. Dr. Hill, welcome.
My first observation is this group is much more humane than a typical econ conference. I've never received an applause before starting, so thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to participate. It was a joy to read the book and to get to have an opportunity to dialogue about it. In his book, which has already been expressed, Jason seeks to make clear the distinctions between the natural and the social sciences and to illuminate to us the dangers of conflating the two. He pushes for a different method of interpreting or understanding the work of social scientists across their respective disciplines. So I think his primary prescriptive element is taking on a new method of interpretation when we read social scientific texts or social texts. Overall, I found myself, like Joseph, sympathetic to a lot of what Dr. Blakely presents. I'm thankful to have had the opportunity to read the book, and I do think it'll change the way I practice my discipline. So what do I agree with? What do I want to emphasize? First of all, a major claim in the book, which has already been exposited, is that social science isn't just an exogenous study of what is, but rather in the act of seeking to understand, it modifies behavior, it creates culture, it builds our reality. There's been several examples of the double hermeneutic. I crafted a very clear example. I wanted to use it, but it feels like a waste of time now, so I'm not sure if I should. But I think he's right. I think that it was kind of striking to me that economists often analyze ad nauseum about unintended consequences of policies, and I think that's good. But we haven't done like the meta thing to analyze the unintended consequences of our own studies themselves. So I think this is a good practice that we ought to be engaging in. However, one thing that I felt throughout the whole reading and grew more concerned about as I read is that any attempt to better understand ourselves is necessarily going to build our own reality. It's not so what I think is really important to Jason's work is to not mistakenly think that scientific methods applied to society are somehow uniquely exempt. But if we do this through myth or storytelling or imaginative hermeneutics, we're also going to be creating our reality. So there isn't an option to kind of avoid it. I think it's more important that we're cognizant in the process of practicing our disciplines that we're doing it. And then a second criticism is that if we conflate natural and social science, we start to interpret humans in a mechanistic and reduced form. If we really are just the sum of our parts, a bunch of physical and chemical reactions responding to a deterministic chain of cause and effect, well, if that's true, then maybe that's right. But as Jason argues, and I definitely agree, humanity cannot ever be fully captured by what can be systematically observed. If we only use the tools of science in our study of humanity, we'll never be able to fully capture who we are. With that said, though, I found myself going down the road of Glenn's speech, rather than Jason's prescription, specifically that we need to be more explicit about the boundaries, I'm an economist, so of economic thought, and intentionally to highlight the importance of other ways of knowing. One example of this being done in a manner I thought was very constructive was by the Catholic economist and theologian Mary Hirschfeld in her book Aquinas in the Market. Mary identifies two parts to what seems to be the most popular virtue to mention in these talks, because I think this is the third definition of prudence that is being offered. But she defines it in two parts. One is choosing the right ends to pursue, and the second part of prudence is the practical wisdom in the proper pursuit of those ends. I think what needs to be done for economics is to be very clear that economics is a great tool to start to think about that practical wisdom, the second part. But it should be, we should never look to economics to help us with the first. It is totally empty with telling us what objectives we ought to pursue. And if we start to think it will, then that's problematic. So if we understand the shortcoming, though, and we don't look to economics to form our objectives, but rather to assist in their pursuit, then I would argue that it does have a lot of value for society. So to use an example from Blakely's book, there's a bit of criticism in the inability of economics to evaluate, or that it presents as, without distinction, different objectives. For example, volunteering in a soup kitchen or earning oodles of income in the finance sector. And that's presented as a shortcoming, but my takeaway would be that we should emphatically emphasize and highlight that figuring out what to pursue is far more important than its efficient pursuit, and be clear that economics is only ever going to be able to help us with the latter. If we think of economics as prescriptive in what we ought to pursue, then we've already stepped beyond the bounds of what we ever should be intending. So while there's problems with social science practiced in a manner similar to the natural sciences, I think we'd also be impoverished if we threw these methods out altogether. We want to keep it as one way of knowing in a toolbox of multiple epistemologies. Part of wisdom is knowing which tool to use when. And I do agree with Jason that often we've used some tools of social sciences in areas where they ought not to be applied. Okay, so my second concept is discussing the case studies which make up the majority of the book. So Jason's main thesis is applied to an impressive breadth of examples drawn from economics, psychology, political science, and I found these case studies to be stimulating and interesting to reflect on. However, I found the particular research of writings that I was familiar with to be uncharitable or even misleading. Ironically, these examples or case studies which were intended to reinforce Jason's primary thesis caused me to also grow wary of and uncertain of alternative ways of knowing or understanding. Imaginative and scientific genres are both at risk of being wielded in ways that manipulate, oppress, transform, or can be used to elevate and contribute towards the flourishing of society. Both are powerful tools, and I'm not sure that one is necessarily more likely to lead us to truth. There were several times I found myself thinking it was ironic that the very humility that Jason was requesting from those he accused of scientism seemed to be lacking in the case studies of the double hermeneutic. He makes strong, specific, and if fully accurate, damning claims that link research of people like James Hugh Wilson and Charles Murray linking them to specific societal outcomes. For example, we've already discussed the rational choice theory spawned the broken windows approach to policing, which was responsible for specific examples of police brutality. Certainly, it's a valid hypothesis. I actually really appreciated the logic that he presented, and I'm guessing that aspects of what Blakely presents are true. But to me, the connections which were not confirmed, fully proven, or solely responsible for observed outcomes were presented as truth. And this method that Blakely employed to persuade his readers struck me as eerily susceptible to many of the same critiques he was making of the current practices by mainstream social scientists. Another example was the Thaler and Sunstein's book, Nudge. In the book, their research was presented as them being like elitist, technocratic puppeteers of society. But when I read their book, it seemed that they were very concerned with maintaining the freedom of individual thoughts, just that we don't have the capacity or the desire to pursue an understanding of every single individual subsect of decisions we make, and that we can't exempt ourselves from choosing default. So, I don't know, there's just a gap between my direct reading of the primary sources and the interpretation. So Jason's thesis, I think, is very strong. It's strong enough to stand on its own. It's important, and I'm concerned that if the examples used are inflated or biased in their presentation, they may prevent serious consideration by the very people who I think would most benefit from the arguments. So I've offered agreement with the distinctions between natural and social sciences, and I've questioned whether some of the dangers may exist in alternative ways of practicing our disciplines. In this last section, I want to focus on the prescription offered at the end of his book. Man doesn't live by bread alone. Jason suggests that the current mainstream hermeneutic for interpreting social science is too similar to natural science, and I wholeheartedly agree. We don't live by bread alone, nor can we fully understand ourselves or our societies through objective science alone. The very source of the quote comes from Deuteronomy 8:3, and it continues that ultimately we live by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord, a conclusion that science is incapable of confirming or rejecting or even considering. So we must have a broader diet. We've overindulged in the scientific, and our society is emaciated in certain methods of understanding itself. I myself work at a liberal arts college. I'm so thankful for the important questions addressed in my students' literature, philosophy, and theology courses, among others. Recent failures of leaders in the tech sector, I think, bring to acute light the importance of a fuller self-conception. I guess my primary question after reading the book would be as follows, is at the end of the book, Blakely's prescribed solution to the presented problem is the reading of social science text under a different hermeneutic, specifically, I'm quoting, as an imaginative, ethical, and politically exhortative genre. He gives examples of books like Genesis or the Communist Manifesto of examples of this genre. I'd like to better understand if this prescription is for the totality of social science work, or if it's prescribed as an additional tool that ought to be increased in application. To clarify, Jason is explicitly supportive of the natural sciences. He also employs the work of very empirical work of various social sciences to support his claims. In a specific example, he refutes the effectiveness of zero-tolerance policing by presenting empirical evidence, and it's presented as evidence, not as imaginative. So what, if any, then, is the remaining role of careful empirical work in the social sciences, and how do we know, I guess similar to Joseph's question, how do we know whether it's incorporated properly and in how it's presented and interpreted? Personally, I would argue that we cannot fully understand ourselves or our societies through an exclusive application of either hermeneutic method. The things that I hold most precious in life will never be empirically observable nor quantifiable. At the same time, no amount of extended conversations with individuals nor theoretical philosophy as effectively capture systematic patterns or changes in things like educational attainment, poverty, inequality, disease, or life expectancy. There's a lot of well-known and well-intentioned examples of projects seeking to aid humanity which achieved to some extent the opposite of their intent in a way that wasn't uncovered until a more empirical introspective method was applied. Each method is subject to a different kind of shortcoming and provides something of value. Okay, so basically, appreciated the book, really thankful for the conversation. I'm just not yet ready to throw out the mainstream hermeneutic entirely. I'd rather want to understand how we balance these two ideas. So thank you very much.
Okay, could not possibly hope to respond to these comments. There was so much brought up, right, and so thoughtfully, so intelligently that once again I'm going to have to wave my hands at the inadequacy of an attempt at an answer. A few things that come up that might help clarify too for people who have not read the book and might be of more general interest. So I hear in Enoch's concerns partly this issue of, okay, what are the role of social science methods, particularly economics, I should say there are many economics And the dominant school is neoclassical economics, which I have serious beef with, but I actually think some of its methods are still helpful. The way neoclassical economics works is that it makes axioms of like an ideal rational agent, rational choice theory, like their preferences can be ranked, they can be maximized, so they're different features, they're transitive. But so is my position that we should throw out, neoclassical economics, rational choice theory, game theory, et cetera? No, that's not my position. And Enoch is right to perceive that that's not my position. My position is actually multi-methods. But my worry with neoclassical economics, just to take one case in the interest of time, is that it usurps an anthropology. So I'm worried that when we build these models, we often slide into, my economist friends fudge it, they'll say it's just an ideal model, they're just model building, but then they'll often slide into, no, this has actually got descriptive traction on the world, or we should care about it because it approximates or gives us predictive power, Milton Friedman's famous answer. And I don't think it gives predictive power, can't make good on that claim right now, and I definitely don't think it's descriptive. So then what the heck is it? Exactly, and why am I not saying let's just abolish it entirely? Well, it's still an as-if or hypothetical scenario you can go through to generate information about the social world if the social world approximated that. I happen to think one of the reasons economics looks plausible to us is because we are involved in practices constantly of ranking goods in consumer societies where we kind of approximate this. We become rational this way about things like bubblegum and cars and houses, but I don't think we ever become rational this way about unboundable, like immeasurable goods that are the goods of political, religious, and cultural life. So I'm multi-methods, but I believe in a complete shift in paradigm toward interpretive or historical approaches. So my issue, this is probably too much in the weeds, but I'm not one of those interpretive or hermeneutic philosophers who thinks all social science should be ethnography. I admit there's a very big affinity with ethnography or local knowledge, deep cultural knowledge, and history, careful interpretation, language study, and my approach. But my view is that it's philosophical and hermeneutics becomes universal. There's no opting out of it because the level at which it has to come back is explaining human behavior has to be narrative. So I think that the social sciences are storytelling disciplines like history and like literature, but they don't know it. And they often suppress or repress storytelling. And so social scientists need to be more aware of the stories they're telling. They might still produce data, but it's a big mistake to say like the data is like story neutral. Stories have ethical dimensions to them, the kinds of stories to tell, the stories we want to tell about society. And stories don't offer predictive knowledge. And so part of the reason I'm so hard on Thaler and Sunstein and people like that is, and I'll end on this, is because I think their claim to predictive knowledge is bogus. So when, this is an example that is very famous in Nudge, it opens with this, sorry, it's kind of crude, but the fly in the urinal, for the women who haven't been in men's bathrooms, there's a fly in the urinal to encourage us to pee at the fly. Now, it's said that nudges people and our irrational biases toward doing that. That's claimed to be a predictive claim of cognitive bias. I think that's missing cultural or storytelling elements. Imagine that some people get really mad at the fly because they don't like technocrats and they start peeing on purpose away from the fly just to upset the technocrats. Or, I've got a 5-year-old son, maybe he doesn't want his pee to touch the fly for some weird reason, 5-year-olds are like that. Or, it becomes an important cultural symbol or political symbol, and so they don't want to pee on the fly. So you see what I'm saying? So I think it's mission impossible to have the predictive knowledge, and so that's part of why I'm so hard on the technocrats, yeah.
Okay. And last but not least, to offer initial comments is Dr. Jennifer A. Frey. She's Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of South Carolina, where she's also the Peter and Bonnie McCausland Faculty Fellow in the College of Arts and Sciences. However, as of July 1st, she'll be the inaugural Dean of the Honors College at the University of Tulsa in Oklahoma. In 2015, she was awarded a multi-million-dollar grant from the John Templeton Foundation titled Virtue, Happiness, and the Meaning of Life. She has published widely on virtue and moral psychology, and she has edited 3 academic volumes on virtue and human action. Her writing has been featured in Breaking Ground, First Things, Fair Forward, Image, Law and Liberty, The Point, USA Today, and the Wall Street Journal. Thank you very much, Dr. Frey, and welcome.
I keep taking the mic.
Okay, so I will interrupt this academic liturgy to make a confession, which is that I was supposed to give Jason comments in advance, and I didn't manage to do that, so mea maxima culpa. I just didn't realize that I would basically be a dean now, and it's slowly killing me. So anyway, so maybe we shouldn't force Jason to have to come up and respond to comments that I'm just giving him right now. So I really enjoyed reading your book, and I just want to begin with a little anecdote that kind of maybe explains why the book resonated with me. As was mentioned in my little bio, for 3 years, I did an interdisciplinary project. It involved philosophers, theologians, and social scientists. We had a couple of economists, and we actually had Dan McAdams on our project. So, sorry, he writes about Dan in his book. And so personality psychologists, and a sociologist or two. And at any rate, we were trying to suss out the connections between the cultivation of excellent habits, the virtues, and the extent to which, this is related to increased sense of meaningfulness or purposefulness in your life, and then also happiness. And this was, for me, like a crash course in how the social scientists were thinking about happiness and meaning in life, and then also something that they call self-transcendence. So I had been doing this work, and in 2018, I was invited by the Veritas Forum to go to Yale. And I was supposed to dialogue/debate Dr. Laurie Santos. How many people know who Dr. Santos is? Okay, not very many people. So Dr. Santos is probably one of the most famous professors at Yale right now, and she's famous for one reason. She taught the most popular undergraduate course in Yale's history. It was so popular that they had to move it out of an auditorium and into a music hall. The course was called Psychology and the Good Life. And I was invited to Yale. I sat in on her class, and I was introduced to her class as a religion professor. I guess because I talk a lot about Aquinas. But at any rate, what did I learn in her class that day, and subsequently learned from listening to her podcast? So what was she teaching young students at Yale? You are your brain. Your brain is a computer. You can hack into yourself so that you can be happier. What does it mean to be happier? It means that you will be more productive, better at making decisions, according to decision theory, of course, and more successful at getting what you want, right? That's what it is to be happy. And when pressed, right, to describe like what really is happiness, like how could we think about it on, I don't know, a metaphysical level, it turns out that happiness is just the condition in which we can say that your individual subjective states are more positive than negative. Like if we counted them all up at any given point, if it came out more on the positive side than the negative side, then you're happy. And if it doesn't, then you're not happy. It's really as simple as that. And I think she threw in maybe a cognitive qualifier or something. But on her view, if you could manipulate yourself somehow through drugs or virtual reality or whatever, but if you could manipulate your subjective states so that they came out in the right way, I mean, that's happiness, right? There's nothing more to it than that. Now, I was on a stage at Yale. There were like 600, mostly students in the audience. And of course, I'm a philosopher. I write about happiness all the time, so I'm objecting strenuously. I bring up the experience machine, she'd get in it. But I'm objecting, but it really, it sort of clarified for me, the problem that I was really in. I mean, here I was, a Catholic philosopher, coming to Yale to debate this professor, and she has the authority of Yale and the authority of science. Like, what do I have, right? Tradition, common sense. I know a lot of Aristotle. None of that really seemed relevant. I mean, did I just have the authority of reason? Anyway, I bring this up just to say that, of course, your general critique resonates with me, the double H effect, and I think you see the same thing going on here, right? But I think, it does raise this question, which is really like the problem of modernity, which is the problem of authority, right? And I just think that philosophers are going to face the exact same problem, so it's kind of like, I'm a little bit worried that we've just kicked the can, and we haven't really solved anything. So let me make that a little bit more precise. So you say that we're narrative creatures, right? That we're storytelling creatures. Well, that's disputed, right? So many philosophers have questioned this. Kieran Sedia, who was on my dissertation committee, we disagree about everything, but still, he's a philosopher now at MIT. He devotes a chapter of his most recent book, Life is Hard, which I reviewed in the Wall Street Journal. He devotes a chapter of his book saying that not only are we not narrative creatures, but actually, insofar as we mistakenly take ourselves to be narrative creatures and try to construct a life story, we make our lives harder. We give ourselves more anxiety, and we should just give up this idea that we're narrative creatures and just let our lives unfold blissfully unconcerned that it have any narrative arc or tidiness to it. And here he's drawing a lot on the work of the analytic philosopher Galen Strawson. Kieran and I are both analytic philosophers. So here we have a disagreement, right, about human nature. So how are these substantive philosophical disputes settled? You suggest that the art of interpretation and its value is something that is going to help us. And so, one question that I had is, I suppose the major question that I had reading your book, because like I said, I think the critique and the analysis is good, and I'm super sympathetic to it, but I am not sure that I understand what the positive solution is supposed to be, and whether or not, again, the positive solution is going to fall prey to the same objections. I'm an analytic philosopher, so, we don't read Gadamer or Charles Taylor. We don't even read Alasdair MacIntyre, though of course I did. But we're reading Frege and Russell and people like this, and then of course we're also reading the contemporary Aristotelians like Philippa Foot and Elizabeth Anscombe, and that was sort of the tradition that I found myself working in. And now look, maybe this is a massive failure of analytic philosophy departments. It could be. It could definitely be. It's a failure that they don't teach MacIntyre, in my opinion. But I'm not sure that MacIntyre is a hermeneutic philosopher, right? I think after Virtue, right, that's where you get the storytelling stuff. But I think MacIntyre became more Thomist over time. But let's just say that the solution will be in the art of interpretation. Well, there's going to be competing interpretations. Who adjudicates, right? Who's the authority? When we look at all of these competing interpretations. And I think the question was especially pressing for me personally because you talk so much about how we need the art of interpretation or hermeneutic philosophy for the explanation of human action. So that's like my whole career right there, is trying to explain human action. And I don't do it, I don't think, from the hermeneutic perspective, right? I'm drawing on Aristotle, well, mostly Aquinas, but I just call it Aristotle so that everyone will listen to me. And, you know, there, right, what are the primary concepts? It's not narrative, it's the voluntary intention, habit, pleasure, moral object of the act, etc. So, like, am I doing something else? Am I doing it all wrong? Is it hopeless? So that's the bells are ringing, so I need to be quiet. Anyway, thank you for your book.
Yeah, that was great. I love a philosopher's ability to get right to the heart of the matter, and it really is a question of ontology and anthropology. I was trained by analytic philosophers too. I don't know if you knew this at Berkeley. I am not supposed to say this anymore because he's a persona non grata because he was misbehaving so badly, but John Searle was on my dissertation committee, and he also couldn't make any sense out of like these claims about narrativity and so on. Of course, Charles Taylor, one of his advisors was Elizabeth Anscombe, and he was trained analytically at Oxford. And so partly I agree with what you're saying, partly I also consider myself a neo-Aristotelian. I consider Gadamer neo-Aristotelian. I consider hermeneutics neo-Aristotelianism. Taylor's book that became off his dissertation with Anscombe was called The Explanation of Behavior, and it's a defense of teleological explanations. But there is a disagreement there because I think analytic philosophy, here's my beef with analytic philosophy and why I don't self-identify as an analytic philosopher, is sort of beholden, fighting words, to naturalism and ahistoricism. Like, you can give an ahistorical conceptual analysis without narrativity, without a historical tradition that sort of proves things like in a freestanding way, whereas I think things advance internal to a tradition. Which is Gadamer's point, and so philosophy itself has to become historicized or narrative in some way. That's not at all an answer philosophically, but it kind of places on the map how I think of analytic philosophy, and I'm interested in the analytic philosophers who turned away from it, McIntyre, Taylor, because all these were great analytic philosophers until they were apostates who weren't considered anymore. Or Bernard Williams I really like, though he is an atheist and Nietzschean, but I think he's a really good philosopher. The point about contention, yes, and the point about how do we decide. Self-narration, right, which is something McIntyre talks about by other people, like the best theory is the one that can self-narrate. But one thing about hermeneutics is it can self-narrate contestability. If you come from a philosophical school like hermeneutics, you don't expect there to be, I think that's the influence of the natural sciences, like the argument everyone sees through freestanding reason, rationalism, or empiricism, the facts that finally make us, right? Because human agency or anthropology is only completed in the medium of culture, what kind of selves we want to be is in part a question that's completed only through interpretation, and interpretation is disputable. So we are in this kind of situation of endless contestability in the social sciences, and I think, and in philosophy, but I would maintain that hermeneutics can account for that, whereas other schools of rationalism or empiricism or the social sciences can't as well. And so I'm interested in this idea of epistemic crisis that's also McIntyre's, that if there are enough problems with a research paradigm or way of working in the world, then you move to a better one. Happiness, I love that example, wonderful example. And yes, I've been there where the authority of science and everything else is sort of arrayed. And I guess one thing I would say about that is I see those paradigms as self-defeating and unable to self-narrate. So one thing we can do is, what Hegel called immanent critique, so we can look for things inside the theory that don't work on its own terms, right? But also we can pose the question, like with the happiness case, but are more people happy when they take on this model? And something I say in the book is no. In fact, we're a society that's awash in like anxiety, depression, and all kinds of mental illness, even as we supposedly have a better and better grip scientifically on how to treat it. Is that because there's no scientific basis to psychological disorders? No, but it's because we've like reduced and flattened them Yeah, but once you get out of the natural science, once you go full-on hermeneutics, which is my thing, then objectivity becomes comparative and never like final or absolute, like in the sciences, or the mistaken view of the sciences, where I have a proof. Instead, we have contestability extended through tradition and comparison, trying to put each other in epistemological crisis. My view can narrate yours better, Yale professor than, yours can. So that would be my weak answer.
Thank you all very much for your initial comments. We're going to kind of go to a phase now. It's more conversational. So at first, I'd just like to invite, if any of the panelists, if there's something that came up that you want to respond to that you didn't have, either from one of the other panelists or from Dr. Blakely, and audience, be thinking of, in a few minutes we will turn to Q&A. I've got one or two questions here, but also be thinking if you have questions. And so the bells won't ring anymore. So now we're in free for all. All right.
I just want to respond. I really appreciated the example, too, of the positive psychology and the subjective well-being. I do want to say, though, we can separate, so I think that the distinction that needs to be made is the ends we pursue can't be resolved in the social sciences. Like, the social sciences can't tell us what ends we ought to pursue. And so my beef with that, I think Adam Smith says that man desires not just to be loved, but to be lovely. Like, until we have self-affirmation, we can't accept the approval of others. So, even if you feel happy, but it's not appropriately attained, it's the ends that are mistaken. But then I think that we can, the rational choice theory framework, I actually when I read scripture, I see it all over the place, just like I see the double hermeneutic all over the place. So I think God motivates us to love deeper and fuller and truer things and to forsake lesser goods for greater goods. Like he says, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. And that seems it's in a reordering of loves. It's certainly Augustinian, but it is also, an ordering of desire and saying, actually dying to yourself and loving God with all your heart and loving your neighbor and giving up everything is the truest flourishing. And if you don't pursue it, then you're mistaken. So I don't think these are as diametrically opposed as maybe seem to be presented by my colleagues, which I appreciate the critiques. I do appreciate the critiques. I just don't think that they can't be reconciled.
I just want to throw out a proposal, and then you can respond. You suggest that the way forward is the art of interpretation, and it's possible that on some construal of that I'm 100% on board. I think I just left the book not really knowing what it was. So that's your next book. but as much as I love philosophy, devoted my life to it, I don't think it's the answer, right? So I think a lot of the problems with the kind of, knowledge economy or something that we have right now is found in our education institutions. So, for example, our universities. What do our universities crank out? They crank out specialists. They crank out experts, right? Even, frankly, in the humanities. I just think anyone who denies this is not being realistic. And this strikes me as one of the central problems. And it's the reason why nobody's able to look at the whole anymore. The whole human person. We can hive off chunks of it. Nobody's able to look at the whole of tradition anymore. One, because nobody's teaching it, but two, because just structurally it's set up so that you can't do that. You've got to find your chunk and you got to say something new, right? That's the imperative. You got to create new knowledge. And I think part of the solution is just that we have to reconfigure this differently somehow. We have to get back within each of the disciplines to looking outside of that disciplinary silo and trying to be mutually informed, trying to look at the whole. Now, that's not an individual problem, that's an institutional problem, but it does strike me as deeply related to what you're talking about. And when I spent 3 years working with social scientists, it was fantastic. It was fantastic for me. I learned a ton, but they were also like, yeah, it is kind of weird how we're talking about this. Like, maybe we should operationalize this differently.
Yeah, it's good you're a dean now, because I think we need more of that outlook at the administrative level in universities. But right, so my prior book actually is called Interpretive Social Science. It was written with Mark Beaver, and it's all about a paradigm for pursuing the human sciences that is narrative, interpretive. What would that mean in terms of objectivity? What would that mean in terms of explanation? I hate to do the, like, I have a book thing, but God help you, you already read one. You don't need to read two. But since I'm being pressed on the answer, it's true, the answer is not in We Built Reality, which is mostly critical, and that one has a positive program. But one thing I'll say about that, because I have a lot of thoughts on it, but just one thing I'll say is that I would, because it came out in several of the comments, is once you view human anthropology as narrative or self-interpreting, as Taylor says, then my hermeneutics is anti-elitist in the sense that we're significance creatures, we're meaning creatures, and I like what you said about philosophy having limits and embedded with, well, within what? I mean, reason is a weak force for me. I mean, of course, I would say that, but reason is a weak force. It doesn't mean I'm against reason. It's just reason can't secure or finally resolve for us the problem of meaning as humans. And so when we're doing social science, for example, we need to listen to people at the local level. You could call this cultural studies or ethnography, from the bottom up to grasp even the object of study, you know, like the stupid urinal example. Like, local knowledge is going to be needed. Ethnography, thick description, Clifford Geertz calls it thick description. And so I link hermeneutics to participatory democracy, to the idea that it's very hard to govern from very far away. You need to govern some things from far away, don't get me wrong, but a lot needs to be governed locally because cultures are local, meanings are local, stories are local. And I'd say that about universities too. I mean, we have to be in a dialogic relationship with our students, with other faculty, because the meaning question isn't something over which you could have expertise. You could grow in a tradition of meaning, take, you know, different traditions of meaning like Aristotelianism, but there's nothing like a science of meaning or a way of rationally, through syllogism, securing the final meaning. So I'm actually also anti-elitist, but because I think we're meaning-making creatures, right? And so meaning-making pushes us back on listening to each other and realizing I can't just resolve the meaning problem for other people quickly without listening, without dialogue, without hearing their story. So narrative is central to the human sciences at the micro level, individuals, at the macro level, communities, like hearing their stories. Did you want to?
Would any of the panelists want to respond to the issue Dr. Capizzi kind of raised at the beginning about how influential is social science really as an authority? You know, we mentioned the paradox, and Dr. Frey brought up an example of at least somebody who's sort of, you know, is exhibiting the double hermeneutic effect you're talking about, instructing students to think of themselves as, you know, their machines are their brains are machines and everything like that. But at the same time, I mean, that doesn't necessarily go to kind of, you know, the broad swath of society, you know, most of society. These are people in elite institutions, right? So I don't know, did anybody care to comment on that?
I mean, on some level, it's an empirical question, so I don't know, but I think that these things, I mean, it seems true and empirically borne out that, like, lots of people, like only an elite class is, like, buying these books, even the popularized versions of these books, but there is a trickle-down effect there that would need to be traced out, and that is to say, like, how do these books influence the institutions that ultimately influence, which is to say, our institutions of education. And there, actually, what you'll find is that I think the influence is pretty deep. Yeah, and you could trace it. I mean, yeah, because if you look at, I mean, you could sort of look at any MA program or credentialing program for teachers, and that would be very instructive, I think.
Yeah, and I would add to that. So, because a criticism that's come up in my book quite frequently, and I didn't get to answer it, that came up in both Joe and Enoch's comments, is how do you know these things to be empirically the case? And Enoch rightly perceived that sometimes I appeal to the very social science I'm criticizing. So how do we know social science is out there in the world? I agree with Jen, that's an empirical question. I think there are different ways in which social science can affect society, different ways of conceptualizing that are going on in the book. One way is very clear, it's top down, okay? So like there's a white paper that's written or a policy paper and then it's implemented. Bush said, for example, that democratic peace theory justified the invasion in Iraq. You know, Bush officials said that. So it was a scientific theory about democracies don't fight each other, we'll democratize the Middle East, and it was justified. Another top-down example, the pandemic. Science says bars can be open. I actually have an article coming out on this. Bars can be open, churches can't, right? That's overreach. That's a kind of, the pandemic is serving a function there as like a supposedly scientific object about which we don't have meaning questions that we debate. So that's one route, is top down. Like nasty elites impose their technocracy, but I actually think they're bottom-up forms of techno-populism, I call them, that basically like, sorry to pick on something, but like the Tea Party, for instance, like a way of talking about the economy is a science, and if we just organize society according to free market economics, right, taxed enough already, we will know that we'll be prosperous. Why do we know this? We know this because there's sometimes there's bottom-up movements that are techno-populist. Stalinist Marxism, I think, was like this in a very different way. Bottom-up movements, I guess calling Stalinism bottom-up is not quite right, but another example would be discursive analysis. And in the book, I talk about how in the 90s it became very common to just say the economy, or early aughts, the economy. Well, what's the economy? Like, it's a measure on a dashboard I talk about. Like, what's included in the economy? Homelessness? No, that's not in the economy. Ecological devastation? No, not the economy. We're talking about like GDP and different indicators that are supposedly objective. That's a discourse that floats around. So how would we prove that? Analyzing a discourse. So we can do a discursive analysis of the way people talk. So I think there are different ways in which social science enters: top-down, bottom-up, discursive analysis, and so and you can verify those in different ways by citing, like the white paper or the policy paper, analyzing the discourse that's going on. Yeah. So I do think there's an effort. I'm a political philosopher, so I'm often like accused of like not being in touch with the world. And so I do think it's an empirical claim that needs to be verified in some way, yeah. I don't know if someone wants to respond to that.
That was the part of the paper I actually agreed with. I mean, another example that Jason uses is ADHD, or I think you use psychological diagnostics, and our self-understanding of whether problems arise through mechanistic reasons or through more transcendent understanding or self-conception in other ways. And I think at least anecdotal experience seems very persuasive there. And I'd agree with, I mean, it's commonly known that game theorists are like the biggest jerks on campus. So, and it might be a self-hermeneutic, or a double hermeneutic approach. Who knows? I mean, I like our game theorists in my school, so.
Well, do we have any questions from the audience? Let's go ahead and, okay, yes, we'll go around with the mic.
My name is Madeline Austin, and I'm a first-year PhD student studying political theory. And I had a professional question for you all, kind of speaking to the comments on disguising Aquinas as Aristotle and operating within a program or a system that values specialization and kind of working in silos. Do you have any advice to young professionals, kind of rising academics, in playing the game and operating within that system while staying true to kind of what seems to be unpopular ways of developing your intellect and professionally? Thank you.
I mean, as someone who ignored every bit of professional advice ever given me, I'm like a little bit, it's like, don't have kids when you're a grad student. I had 4. Like, don't let people know that you're religious. I was like really like Virgin Mary all over my carol. Like, don't, do this or that. I just kind of was like myself. And I'm still here. However, I do think that in the more professional-facing context, like when you're submitting papers for publication and you're choosing a dissertation topic or whatever, you do have to be savvy about where is this actually going to get published, right? Who are the best interlocutors for me to have? It's a strategy game. And so I think that's where, for me, of necessity, very early on in my career, I had to respond in ways that I didn't love, but like could still advance my work. And, now I'm a full professor, and so I just get to go full on me, love it or leave it. But I do think that like you can simultaneously like be yourself and very strategic professionally, and it just has to do with like living in reality, right? Seeing what the top journal in your field cares about, and then responding to that from your own perspective. Making sure that you're going to the right conferences and that you're, that sort of thing. That's what I would say.
Other questions?
So I wanted to press you on your claim that the predictive nature of the social science is totally bunk. Maybe it's probabilistic or something, but if someone were to say institute rent control that goes below market prices, you're right that it's possible that landlords could clean out their savings so that they could maintain buildings at a price below what it takes to keep the buildings going, but it's highly unlikely, right? So it seems to me that the predictive power is at least probabilistic. So I was just wondering if you would comment on that.
Yeah, and obviously we have the ability to foresee something in social reality, because I got here from California somehow, and it's a very precise point we all got to here in this room, and so I don't want the message to be like we don't have clairvoyance or understanding. It's a very narrow objection I have to the claim that the kind of prediction we have is impersonally, mechanistically causal. My beef is with the idea that you have strong prediction, like narrow, mechanistic, strong prediction, like you do in the natural sciences, where as long as a certain antecedent set of conditions are set up, sorry for the jargon, then the consequent happens. And I think in the social sciences, that can always be resisted because of human agency. And because we can reinterpret the situation differently, which is part of the massive frustration in the social sciences. I mean, no one agrees what the master social science is. I mean, everyone sort of within their specialization might think psychology explains it, social science, various schools of social science, economics, but these are conflicting paradigms. They don't just fit together. And often the rival paradigms are very good at pointing out flaws or the predictive inabilities. Ken using methods from the social sciences, like game theory is useful to me as an as-if scenario. So I'm not saying throw out neoclassical economics, I'm saying look at it as what if everyone behaved this way, then one possible outcome is this, like a crisis of the commons or like a run on supply or whatever it is. Knowing that that's just a as-if scenario that needs to be put back in cultural context. Will people do this or not, and how will it respond locally will have to do with culture, ethnography, people's self-interpretation. So I want to re-embed economics. I think there's a possible economics that's more like 19th century economics, but really new, that is historical and narrative. And my dream of like a future social science would be, it's not that you get rid of the game theory models, but once you say they're not describing reality and they can't strong predict it, well, what are we doing with this information? We need to re-embed it within cultural knowledge. Economics needs to become historical, narrative again, in my opinion. And all the social scientists need to be more humanistic and have historical, narrative, cultural knowledge. and see rational choice theory would be very limited, on my view, very, very limited, not quite nearly as useful a tool as we thought it was.
Can I just press you on that, though, because let's imagine a social science that's more narrative and cultural. I mean, we have competing narratives about the human person, right? For me, it's the gospel narrative, but I have a real hard time thinking that social science is going to embrace that. So again, it's like, how do we adjudicate these competing narratives for those purposes?
Yeah, and so part of that is this problem. Some research programs continue to fail on their own terms. I happen to think neoclassical economics is like this. I mean, one of the things that's very a big shadow on mainstream economics right now is behavioral economics, because the behavioralists proved psychologically that we don't behave rationally in this way. And so then another science was developed. Let's predict how irrational we all are, right? That's actually Thaler and Sunstein's nudge approach. We just respond to like stimuli in the environment and so on. So one way is research programs continually fail on their own terms. They don't predict. They don't have a good fit with reality. And then the question is, like, in the social science, it's like Hamlet. That's what I tell my students. Like, if I told you I had the final interpretation of Hamlet, you'd look at me like I was crazy. But that's not the same as saying every interpretation of Hamlet is as good as the other one. This is frustrating about hermeneutics, but the one that can make the most sense out of the phenomenon as a whole is the best interpretation on offer. And that's the human situation. It's humbling, but we don't have that kind of knowledge that, like, say, the Radical Enlightenment thought we had. And I think a lot of people, inside or outside the Radical Enlightenment, have taken on board, which is like, there's a shortcut. So narrative comparison, like Hamlet, who can make the most sense out of this slice of narrative, this community, this society, etc. My bid would be that ethnography, cultural studies help us make much more sense out of what's going on with an economy than if we just abstract away into like rational choice theory. It might still have a limited use, but we're not seeing a lot of the picture on my view. So yeah, it would be comparative objectivity, not final once and for all objectivity. Yeah.
Oh, you sure? Yeah, I'm just continuing to press. It's come up a couple of times. Sorry, it's come up a couple of times. I'm just really skeptical of people's capacity to tell their stories well, right? So if you think that, which to me strikes me as very Augustinian and also accurate, has the benefit of both being Augustinian and accurate. Why would we think like narrative is going to get us out of these problems, right? Like if you worry that fundamentally people are not really good at telling a story about themselves, and then you add on top of it, like your good points about the way culture and other things impress upon them and inform their stories in certain ways. It's just, it seems to me like it's regressive, and it's not clear how you get out of that, as opposed to maybe this is where Jen is pushing, but I would certainly push, something, ostensibly more objective. I think Jen used the phrase neutrally informed, which I thought was kind of suggestive. But anyway, I can't get past that concern.
Yes, and I'm also something of an Augustinian, so yeah. And it's not, narratives are just like non-optional, that we're narrative in our agency. Like, that's a teleological... So it's a claim. That's a claim. It's a claim about anthropology that itself would be comparative and contested, but I think... sorry for the jargon, but like Aristotelian teleology, that we're purpose or aim-driven creatures, narratives have an aim or purpose. We tend toward a purpose. I take Aristotle's teleological theory to be a narrative theory. He doesn't talk about it that way, but later Aristotelians do. Now, are people bad at telling their stories? Yeah, of course. The only remedy for a bad story is a better story, though. That's just part of being human. So part of what I tried to do in the book is I tried to turn around in this way that was kind of, for me, mind-bending while I was writing it, social science, so that it was stories. I just treated it for stories from the get-go. For years, I'd been obsessed with this, like, I'll show how social science is wrong. I'll show how it's wrong. And in this book, I was just like, I'll just treat social science like stories, bad stories. What's my problem with social science? It's stories that can't make as much sense of the whole. What can't they make sense of? The meanings that aren't just descriptive, for instance. So it's narrative all the way down, in a sense, versus humans. I think that's very Augustinian, that there's no way out except a better narrative. I mean, Manichaeanism didn't make as much sense as Christianity for Augustine. Like, more was illuminated. But he was still on a journey always of conversion toward a bigger story. I mean, even internal to his tradition. So I take narratives to be anthropologically inescapable. People are bad at telling their stories, just like Shakespeare's really good at telling a story. Some people are really, and we're enriched by his storytelling. And so I wish the social sciences saw themselves more like that. We're not looking for the final theory, we're looking for the best story about American society right now, or what's going on in Charlotte, North Carolina right now. We're looking for the best story. We're not looking for the final proof empirically of
So I guess I'm sympathetic to Rachel's question, and I think that I love the story idea. I think ultimately when we're trying to understand meaning, that's where we should go to, is trying to capture the best story. But then I also have to decide whether, like my wife and I are trying to figure out things like, is breastfeeding the only way? Or like, do we co-sleep? Or things like that. And then I read somebody like Emily Oster's book, and I find it incredibly helpful. And she doesn't present things as explanatory or like strongly causal, but she says, okay, look, the statistics say like, whichever one you do, at least is our best understanding right now, there's not a statistically significant difference, so like, don't worry about it too much. Or like with school closures, from what I understand, on the onset of the pandemic, she was very reticent to send her kids to any public setting, but then she just entered with a hands-open questioning approach of like, let's assume everybody has good desires. There's not the good guys and the bad guys. We value life, we value safety, and we also value education. And so it seems like these kinds of questions in this empirical methodological study have a place that isn't answered through narrative.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I'm also not of the view, for instance, I'm very hard on polling, but it's not like polling is completely useless. I mean, it's incredibly helpful to know, how many people are registered X in county Y. I mean, that's an important question. I just think that the problem that happens is that claim to empirical knowledge is often like taken to be an explanation, right? So white women vote Y. And then, of course, we get frustrated all the time because white women doesn't explain anything. It's a shorthand for a story, and it's usually a bad, impoverished story that we didn't listen closely enough to the many sub-stories and cultures within the demographic category white women. Is there still value in very complex statistics to figure this out? Yes, but we constantly get bewitched into thinking like the facts, like the empirical part, explained. So where narrative gets going is at the level of explanation. I think there's still a role for going out with methods from the social sciences that are incredibly helpful to generate knowledge about the world. But I often find that my colleagues in the social sciences get captured by their method, bewitched by it, and think that it's explanatory. Every time you need an explanation, you need a story, because we're living out. And the meaning question comes back, like, do I want to live this way? Is it meaningful? Ought I to live this way, right? Meaning questions come flooding back in, where it looked like there were just factual questions at play, would be my take on that. Did you want to respond to that?
I see something back here. I'm getting my steps in today.
Thank you. Also, thank you for the mic so that I can hear everybody's questions. I appreciate that a lot. My question primarily, I think, is for Dr. Fry, but also for anybody else that wants to chime in. I want to start off by just appreciating Dr. Blakely. I love your approach to narrative. I think that's really helpful. I've wrestled for years with how exactly to deal with the existence of statistics, and as a debate coach, my students are very good at taking any data point and using it to support any claim that they find useful. So they become storytellers with that data. And I know that's usually not how data is intended to be used, but that's how it gets used by, at least by debate students. Dr. Fry, it seems to me that humans being narrative creatures is a necessary foundation for a liberal arts, great books, and great conversations kind of approach to college education. And since you spoke specifically to wanting a generalist approach to solve an over-specialization problem in higher ed, and you're about to be founding a new honors college that looks really exciting. I would love if you could give us kind of where do you see why should I come join your college and study a generalist liberal arts approach if those are not all different disciplines helping me appreciate the narrative of life in this world? What's the foundation for a liberal arts education apart from a narrative anthropology?
Well, thank you for this wonderful and unexpected opportunity for self-promotion. So education is grounded in human nature, right? I mean, because education is the formation of human potential into something that we hope is human excellence. So yes, there is a specific philosophical anthropology that animates my philosophical pedagogy. But I think both strategically and for other reasons, like for me, it doesn't have to be super robust, and I don't have to convince prospective parents that, we're all narrative creatures or something. I think I just need to talk about the natural human desire to know, right? That turns out to be something that just everyone experiences, and I talk about what it is to take that desire and shape it in certain ways. Now, why read our own intellectual tradition, right? Why study it in a serious way as your general education, which is what we're trying to do in this honors college that I'm currently building. I simply talk about the need for wisdom, in particular practical wisdom, and the role that memory and the art of dialectic play in the process of trying to search for wisdom. And, memory, according to Aquinas, is a potential part of practical wisdom. It's like, how are you going to make good decisions if you don't know, if you can't remember previous decisions of yourselves and other people? But I think you can kind of broaden that general claim. How are you really going to understand or critique anything that's going on now if you don't understand where it came from? How are you going to question the concepts that people bring themselves under if you have no idea where they came from, etc.? So I think I just think it's sort of a general claim. Now, I don't actually deny, and I didn't today deny, that we are or are not narrative creatures. There may be versions of that I would completely accept. I simply point it out because it's true that it's a disputed claim. And because that brings back the question of authority. And that is a huge question for Jason's book, I think, but also when we think about scientism, we're just asking questions about authority and power and things like this. So I'm just gonna say the Honors College is gonna be great. It's gonna be great books, but I don't think I think that the foundation of that can and should be thin enough to appeal to a wide array of prospective students and parents. We don't have to get super specific.
I think maybe one more quick question here.
Hi, thank you. Great panel. My question goes to that question of authority, and it's a question about this feeling that Jason mentioned earlier, which is that scientists seem to have this power that we attribute to them in terms of having authority in society, but then they feel powerless. And so my question is is there a way of distinguishing between the scientists themselves, the individuals or groups of teams, and the thing they produce, or the way that that thing that they produce is then reified or turned into something like a big S, capital Science? So it could be that people like Paul Krugman or Cass Sunstein feel really influential, but maybe not. Maybe the individual scientists are not the only storytellers, that the thing that they are producing, whether it's the papers or this thing that gets perceived as science, becomes something that is used in other contexts for different narratives or something like that. So that's a question about that dynamic.
Yeah, thanks. Anyone want to? Yeah. Then I think you'll be the last.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question, and it keeps coming up. I tend to reserve the term science for the natural sciences because I don't think the social or human sciences are sciences proper, and I think it's less helpful, and I wish we would get rid of the word science. I have a physicist friend who's like, we never add the word science when it's a science. We don't say physics science, chemistry science, but we do political science. If anyone was wondering, it's a science. And so that's a nitpick, but because I actually agree with the spirit of the thrust of this question, but I would rather that in the social science people start to conceive of themselves as humanists, and of course a lot of the knowledge they produce is extremely useful. As I was trying to, not doing a good enough job, but like affirm statistics, affirm game theory, but much more narrowed as a method within a broader horizon of historicized humanistic inquiry into human life. And I think the last thing I want to say about that, I'm very interested in Thomas More and Erasmus and the problem of counsel, because they had this problem, but before the natural science revolution, like who counsels power? And More's answer, obviously disastrous, he gets killed for it, it doesn't work out very well, but is that humanists should, and of course he has Hyphaeladae in Utopia. They have this exchange where they're all humanists. They've acquired classical education, historical consciousness, a facility with like languages and texts. They're masters of interpretation. So I have one side of my project kind of democratizing. We have to listen to people's stories. But humanists are kind of authority I'm interested in, clearly. And humanists can sometimes tell our stories better than we can, or can help supplement our stories. So I think the problem of counsel we face is how do humanists, again, become counsel to power, not such that they usurp power top down, but they become counsel to democratized power, small d here, where they listen to people's stories but also reflect back at them what they know about historical depth. So my replacement authority for the scientist would be the humanist, and insofar as people are still standing on the platform of science and their knowledge, they may be saying very useful things. I'll use them, other people use them, and I don't mean to be overly critical actually of the social sciences, but I wish there were a paradigm shift away from that. And so the knowledge that was produced was presented as like contributing to narrative knowledge, historical knowledge, and not scientific knowledge. Because I think we could keep using the word, but it's distracting, it's confusing, we're getting captured by it.
Let's give a round of applause to all of our panelists, please. Thank you all. Thank you very much. I think you've given us a rich discussion, lots of things to think about. I'd like to take a moment to profusely thank the sponsors that we had for this session. We had 3 sponsors who helped us to put on this session, really made it possible. The Institute for Human Ecology, that Dr. Capizzi is the executive director of. It's headquartered at one of those other Catholic universities in the United States, the Catholic University of America. The Nova Forum, where Dr. Blakely is a fellow, headquartered in LA, and then also the Lumen Christi Institute. And so we're very grateful for those sponsorships, and we as Ciceronian Society hope that can provide the foundation for possible future partnerships. Thank you all again very much, and thank you to you all, and have a great rest of the conference.